Okay, in today's lecture, we're going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution. And we're going to be looking at the agriculture that developed, the technology that developed, as well as some of the effects that the new industry had on society. Now, after you watch this lecture, go ahead and watch the John Green Industrial Revolution crash course video to see if there's any similarities or differences in the way that he explains it, in the way that I argue it as well. Now, to begin, let's talk a little bit about what life was like prior to the Industrial Revolution. Now, no other event in history or events in history has had nearly the impact of the Industrial Revolution. Now, most likely, people living in the 1700s could more easily relate to their lifestyle of ancestors 2,000 years earlier than to our lifestyle a mere 200 years later. Now, our life expectancy are more than double that of our ancestors. We travel thousands of miles much more easily, quickly, and comfortably than they could travel 20 or 30 miles. And we are in much closer touch with events on the other side of the globe than they were with events in the next village. And the price we pay for our medical care, balanced diet, rapid transportation, and even mass communications involves much less effort than that they spent for their more primitive comforts and necessities. Now, although industrialization happened rapidly, one can see a long, steady buildup towards it in Western Europe over many centuries. The extensive use of water wheels, windmills, and other labor-saving devices all put the European mentality in touch with exploiting natural resources and laws to increase productivity. The invention of the clock changed Europe's attitudes towards time, disciplining and regulating their lives to a degree of precision necessary for industrialization. And the Enlightenment's scientific discoveries laid the foundations for the dramatic industrial and scientific advantages of the 1800s. All of these developments took place in Western Europe because of a complex variety of forces that fed back on one another to intensify their effects. Now, just as various forces combined to make Western Europe the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, several factors combined to focus on Great Britain as the specific area of Europe where industrialization would first take root. Now, one of these was a rapid growth in agricultural production and the labor force that started with the agricultural revolution in the Middle Ages. Now, this led to three lines of development that would later converge to create a new agricultural revolution in the 1700s. Now, first of all, the three-field system developed in the Middle Ages required nearly all the farmland for growing grain crops. Now, this left little this left little land for grazing cattle, which in turn produced little natural manure for fertilizer. And as a result, crop yields were down, forcing peasants to use most of the land for grain crops, and so on. Now, this made the agriculture fairly stagnant and created the need for a better way of feeding Britain's population. Now, another medieval innovation was the heavy plow, which also generated a vicious cycle. Since peasants were typically too poor to own enough oxen to pull a plow, they had to share plow teams, and as a result, they broke their fields into strips in order to ensure that everyone got at least some of his land plowed. This left everyone's lands interlocked in scattered strips of farmland, and because of that, there was little incentive or opportunity to try new agricultural techniques, since all the peasants had to agree on any changes and switch all the village's lands to the new system. Now, getting everyone to agree to any such changes was extremely difficult. And as with the three-field system, this also made agriculture fairly stagnant, keeping individual peasants too poor to farm independently, forcing them to continue sharing plow teams, and so on. And this also created the need for better agricultural techniques. However, another result of the medieval agricultural revolution was the rise of towns in the High Middle Ages, which unleashed forces that pushed for change in two ways. So first of all, by the early modern era, the rising middle class had bought up much of the farmland in their ambitions for secure investments and noble titles. Now, these landowners were more open to new farming techniques that could earn them more profits. Second, the Enlightenment was discovering new ways to grow better crops, and these factors led to the four-field system that used all four fields rather than leaving one fallow. Now, three advantages. First, it made previously useless and marginal land useful, thus expanding the amount of land under cultivation. Second, it used clover and turnips in the fourth field to maintain the soil's fertility. And finally, with the fourth field now in use, it was using all the land every year rather than having to keep part of it fallow. Now, these factors led to better crop production so that peasants could afford to feed, could afford to could afford feed for livestock, leading to more meat and protein in the common people's diet. Now, unfortunately, this new and more efficient agriculture required large open tracts of land. Now, in the 1700s, the need for better agriculture and the need for large tracts of land for this new type of agriculture led to the enclosure movement, whereby wealthy landowners enclosed the common lands so that they could practice the four-field system. Now, this created two effects that helped lead to the Industrial Revolution. First of all, the enclosure movement drove many people off their lands, forcing them to flock to the cities in search of homes and jobs. And also, this new kind of agriculture doubled food production, leading to dramatic population growth in England in the 1700s. Now, the combination of population growth in the cities created the labor supply for Britain's textile mills when the Industrial Revolution began. Okay, so now what we're going to be looking at next is the technology during the Industrial Revolution. Now, if new agricultural developments provided the backbone for supporting the Industrial Revolution, various technological innovations were its heart and soul. And the root of those innovations and the cultural attitudes so vital for their formation go all the way back to the medieval ages and the Cistercian monks. Now, what triggered all this was the Cistercians' desire to get away from the evils of the world. Now, this led them to found their monasteries in the wilderness, away from civilization, but also away from any outside labor supply upon which they might rely. Now, being thrown back on their own resources, they rediscovered, probably in an old Latin or Greek text that they were copying, the principle of applying water power with a water wheel. Now, the ancient Greeks had come up with this invention along with the principles of steam power. However, the abundance of cheap human labor meant that there was no real need for water or steam power in the ancient world, and as a result, these principles lay largely unused until this time. However, the Cistercians did need such principles and started experimenting with labor-saving water wheels, first applying them to the milling of grain into flour, and then two later inventions dramatically expanded its uses. First, there was the cam, which was a piece of wood set on the drive shaft that struck anything in its way, such as a bellows or trip hammer, with each revolution of the water wheel. Second, there was the crank that could convert the circular motion of the water wheel into oscillating motion. Now, these two developments led to applying water power to a multitude of tasks. They could drive ripsaws, bellows, and water pumps. Now, they were connected to grinding stones for sharpening and polishing tools, weapons, and armor, and they could power trip hammers for falling cloth, crushing sugarcane, and even pounding hemp and rags for rope and paper. Now, the number of mills that sprang up was astounding. William the Conqueror's census in 1089, the Domesday Book, listed no fewer than 5,624 water wheels in England alone. Now, that was one mill for every 50 families and is estimated to have saved the average peasant life 2 to 3 hours of work per day once the tedious task of milling grain was mechanized. Now, the main branch of the Seine River going through Paris had 68 mills. Another 16 kilometers stretch of stream had 30 such mills. Now, wherever rivers were slow, people built dams to increase the water power and floating mills to use that power. And where there were no rivers at all, they applied these mechanical principles to harnessing other types of energy, building tidal mills along the ocean and windmills, originally a Persian invention, on flat open land. Now, by 1600, some 40 different types of industries were wholly or partially dependent on water or wind power, mechanizing such tasks as spinning silk, boring the barrels from cannons and muskets, and making gunpowder. In 1694, Louis XIV's main military engineer, the Marquis de Vauban, estimated that France had 80,000 flour mills, 15,000 industrial mills, and 500 iron mills. Now, as water wheel technology spread across Western Europe, so did a growing awareness of how to exploit mechanical principles in general. Now, in addition to harnessing the power of the tides and winds, Europeans were also developing better clocks, now originally a Chinese invention. Now, in fact, the clock would become the symbol of Europe's increasingly mechanistic view of the universe. However, while Europeans were harnessing time and parceling it out in discrete units of hours, minutes, and seconds, the clock was also more tightly structuring how Europeans lived their lives. This would be another important aspect of the Industrial Revolution as far as conditioning factory workers to the time clock and creating a more precise society. Now, it was Europe's rising ability of how to exploit mechanical principles that led to three lines of technological development that together would culminate in possibly the most critical invention of the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine. Now, those lines of development had to do with mechanical ripsaws, larger bellows, and innovations in the textile industry. Now, Britain in the 1700s was the perfect example of the idea that necessity is the mother of invention, and John Green will argue this in his video as well. The triumph of the mercantile middle class in the English Revolution of the 1600s and the growth of European colonial empires, especially that of Britain, had created global trade links such as had never been seen before. However, opening up such new vistas often creates problems, and that was the case with European textile production. Europe's higher standard of living made its goods and labor more expensive, which led to an influx of cheaper textiles from India that could undersell European and particularly British goods. Now, in order to compete more successfully, British textile producers needed a cheaper and faster way to produce cloth. The answer came with the more mechanized hand loom in 1733, which had a flying shuttle that quickly wove the weft thread in between the warp threads. Now, this could double the speed of production, except for one other problem. The spinning wheel used to spin the thread for the loom was too slow. The solution came with two more inventions in the 1760s: the spinning jenny, which could spin 7 threads at a time, and the water frame, which could use water power to increase the speed of spinning and weaving even more. Now, this series of inventions gave the British textile industry a tremendous boost, and soon textile mills were springing up on just about every available bit of riverfront property. Now, unfortunately, the amount of such property was limited, and soon profit-hungry businessmen were looking for a new power source to drive their looms and spinning jennies. Luckily, all this while a new power source had been emerging, which was the steam engine. Now, as mentioned before, one important application of the water wheel was to drive large bellows and ripsaws. Now, what this made possible was hotter fires with which metal smiths could finally smelt iron, and that provided pure iron for building stronger boilers and steam engines. Now, another important development was the water-powered ripsaw. This was a much more efficient way to cut timber, so efficient, in fact, that by 1600, most of Britain was effectively deforested. Therefore, the English, largely without their primary heat source, or wood, and charcoal processed from wood, had to find something else to burn. They found it in Britain's plentiful coal deposits. Now, one problem with coal is that it burns much less cleanly than charcoal, making it harder to come up with good iron. This was until 1709 when someone discovered a way to process coal into a cleaner and hotter burning substance known as coke. However, it was not until 1783 that a smelting technique known as rolling and puddling was invented, which worked the impurities out of the iron and made it strong and cheap enough for widespread industry's use. Now, with stronger and cleaner iron, people could make boilers able to withstand the higher steam pressures needed for more powerful steam engines. Now, this, of course, was only relevant once the steam engine had been invented, which brings us to another problem with coal. Now, unfortunately, most of Britain's coal was buried in deposits that required the construction of deep shaft mines. Now, eventually, coal miners ran into the curse of all deep mines: water seepage. It was here that a crude steam pump was devised to give steam its first practical job. Unfortunately, this early pump was inefficient and burned nearly as much coal as was being mined. More efficient models were designed, notably that of Thomas Newcomen, but a truly efficient design did not come along until 1769, when James Watt introduced a practical two-chamber steam engine that made steam power economical to use in the mines. Now, not only was steam power practical for the mines, it also found applications in the textile mills for those businessmen not lucky enough to have waterfront property and the free power that went with it. And as a result, British textile production jumped by a factor of 30 times. With each passing year, the hissing, churning, and pumping of the steam engines rang louder in Britain's cities, while the black smoke from burning coal steadily darkened its skies. The Industrial Revolution had been born. Now, for the final part of our this lecture, we're going to be talking about some of the social impacts of the revolution. All right. So today we see the revolution as being responsible for the higher standard of living we enjoy. Now, this of course is true, but there was a great and at times appalling price paid in human suffering to attain this standard of living. From the start, industrialization meant the transformation of countries' populations from being predominantly rural to being predominantly urban. In England, this involved the migration of millions from the agricultural south to the cities springing up near the local coal and iron fields in the north. Now, the populations of Manchester, England, grew from 25,000 in 1772 to 303,000 by 1850. Liverpool's population rose from 80,000 to 397,000 in the first half of the 19th century. Other cities told similar stories of the incredible growth. Overall, in Britain, the number of cities with populations of 50,000 or more rose from only 3 in 1785 to 31 in 1860. And by 1850, Britain had become the first nation in history to have a larger urban than rural population. Other countries would soon follow suit. Now, these early industrial cities created problems in these areas: living conditions, working conditions, and the social structure. First of all, cities were built so rapidly, were also built shoddily. Tenement houses were crammed together along narrow streets, poorly built, and incredibly crowded. Whole families were packed into attics, cellars, or even single rooms, with one house holding 63 people in 7 rooms. Sanitation was virtually non existent, making clean water a luxury reserved for the rich. Open sewers ran down streets carrying water fouled with industrial and even human waste. Diseases such as cholera, typhoid, typhus, and tuberculosis often reach epidemic proportions. Add to these problems air pollution and malnutrition, and one gets a picture of incomparable human misery. Alcoholism, drug abuse, crime, and prostitution were natural outcomes of having to endure these conditions. Now, away from home, uh, working conditions were even worse. Depending on the hours of sunlight, the workday could extend up to 19 hours a day, or I think I put 9 there, but up to 19 hours a day, 6 days a week. The work itself was hard, boring, and tedious. Conditions around the steam engines and in the mines were hot and at times extremely dangerous. In the absence of safety devices, machines often tore off fingers, hands, and even arms. Mine shafts would occasionally explode or cave in, trapping and killing hundreds of workers deep within the earth. Despite all this, there were often long lines of the unemployed waiting for any available jobs. This surplus of labor kept wages excessively low, and as a result, families had to send their women and even their children to work in the factories just to make ends meet. Now, in fact, women and children were preferred as workers because they could be paid less while being worked harder. Now, occasionally, depressions in the economy would lead to more industries shutting down. This left thousands of families with no jobs and no public welfare to see them through such hard times. Even medieval serfs had been assured some rights to a living off their lands, which was more than these people could often enjoy. Now, the Industrial Revolution also upset old social patterns of life and family. Under the old domestic system of cottage industries, peasants worked in their own homes, produced at their own rates, and were paid accordingly. Under the new factory system, laborers worked in the factories owned by bosses whom they rarely, if ever, saw. They had to be at work precisely on time and work at the much faster pace of the machines. Nevertheless, they were paid by the hour, not according to their productivity, since that was cheaper for the owner. Previously, the farm, home, and the workplace were one and the same, with men and women sharing many of the same tasks. In the industrial city, in the industrial city, there was a separation of home and workplace, and a corresponding greater separation of the roles men and women played. In middle-class families, men went to work while women stayed home with the children. In working-class families, men, women, and children all went to work, but usually to separate places. For both middle and working-class families, these were added strains that pulled the family apart. Now, although the nuclear family had generally replaced the extended family in European society since the Black Death, largely in order to keep from splitting up family lands, there was still a network of close friends and relatives in the villages, providing each other mutual support. However, as individual families moved to the cities, they left behind this support network of the villages. However, as support from their villages. Now, the growing numbers of people left helpless and destitute by the rapid change of industrialization did not go unnoticed, and reform movements arose from 3 directions. Some reformers were genuinely concerned industrialists, such as Robert Owen and W. H. Lever, who built model communities in which their workers could work and live. Other reformers were liberal politicians trying to alleviate the suffering of the masses, or conservative politicians trying to avert social revolution caused by such misery. Together, such politicians enacted legislation that gradually eased the plight of the working class, such as the Factory Act of 1833, which limited the use of child labor, and another Factory Act in 1850, which limited women and children to workdays of 10.5 hours. However, many workers felt that for real progress to be made, they would have to work for themselves, and that involved organizing into trade unions, the very existence of which was illegal until 1824. Now, even then, they could only exist as mutual aid societies to provide their members with insurance against sickness and injury. Not until 1871 could British unions represent their members' grievances and actively work for reforms. Now, the struggle for those reforms was a long, hard, and often violent one. However, by the end of the 19th century, trade unions had made substantial progress towards improving the living and working conditions that industrial workers had to endure. Now, the standard of living for workers in the early Industrial Revolution was certainly horrible, but it did improve in the course of the 19th century. Two types of statistics tell us this. First of all, the overall population of Europe rose dramatically from some 187 million in 1800 to about 467 million by 1914. Add to that another 60 million who immigrated to other continents, and one gets the distinct impression that the overall standard of living in Europe was getting harder. Now, on this slide that you see right here, it's where it says population of Europe 1800, that should read 187 million. Now, another figure telling a similar story of progress is the average life expectancy of Europeans during this time. In 1800, most people could expect to live around 30 years or less, depending on their social class. By 1900, the average life expectancy had risen about 50% to 45 years. Better living conditions and nutrition, public sanitation, and great advances in medical science were all responsible for this jump. However, the price of those early generations of factory workers paid for this progress and our own comfortable lifestyle was a terrible one indeed.